Imagine waking up in a stark, windowless room. The morning light barely filtering through thick curtains. Your bed? A hard mattress with a thin blanket, the only comfort in a world ruled by rules, routines, and doctors who believed leeches and cold water could cure your mind. You're a patient in a Victorian asylum, and every day is a careful dance between order, fear, and whatever they call treatment. Oh, and sanity is optional. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you can follow along as we explore history's quirkiest, darkest, and most fascinating corners. Today, we're stepping inside the walls of a Victorian lunatic asylum where medicine met superstition and routines often felt crueler than the illness itself. Buckle up, and don't worry today. The restraints are only metaphorical. In the early 19th century, Victorian society found itself grappling with what it called the problem of the insane. Mental illness, though not a new phenomenon, had become a subject of increasing concern as towns and cities swelled with population growth, industrialization, and the pressures of urban life. The streets were crowded, labor was harsh, and poverty was omnipresent. Those who displayed unusual behavior, emotional instability, or intellectual disabilities were often feared and marginalized. It was in this climate of anxiety, moral judgment, and social reform that the modern concept of the asylum emerged. Unlike the medieval madhouses or private care of eccentric relatives, Victorian asylums were formal institutions, legally sanctioned, and designed to remove individuals from the public eye under the guise of treatment, care, and moral correction. The origins of Victorian asylums trace back to earlier charitable and medical endeavors, including the Bethlehem Royal Hospital, known colloquially as Bedlam, and other regional hospitals. But it wasn't until the 19th century that institutionalization expanded in a systematic, nationwide way. Reformers and legislators believed that the state had a duty to care for, control, and correct those deemed insane. The Lunacy Act of 1845 formalized this approach, requiring counties to provide asylums for their populations and establishing oversight to prevent blatant neglect, or at least in theory. By the mid-1800s, hundreds of asylums dotted the British landscape, from sprawling rural estates to towering urban complexes, each designed to house dozens, if not hundreds, of patients in an attempt to bring order to what society perceived as chaos. Social attitudes toward mental illness were complex, often contradictory, and frequently cruel. On one hand, mental illness was considered a disease, a deviation from reason that required medical and moral intervention. On the other hand, it was interpreted as a moral failing, a punishment for sin, or a sign of weak character. Families, burdened by shame and the impossibility of providing care at home, often sought institutionalization both to protect the community and themselves. To be sent away was both a relief and a humiliation. People whispered about the lunatics in the town asylum with a mixture of fear, curiosity, and gossip. You could almost imagine the neighbors crossing the street to avoid eye contact with someone who muttered to themselves. And meanwhile, the family secretly hoping no one would connect the dots and point the finger at them. Mental illness carried stigma heavier than most bricks used to build these institutions. Class distinctions played a central role in treatment within asylums. Wealthy families had the option to place their relatives in private wards, often elegantly decorated, staffed by attendants trained to maintain appearances and prevent any scandal. The rich could afford better food, more comfortable beds, and a degree of social respectability even in confinement. The poor, however, faced dormitories crammed with dozens of patients, long hours of rigid routines, and meager provisions. The contrast could not have been starker. A patient from an affluent household might read by candlelight, take gentle walks in manicured gardens, and receive individualized attention, while a pauper might labor under harsh rules, eat gruel that smelled faintly of despair, and sleep on straw mattresses that had been in use for years. Yes, class mattered, even when society decided to remove you from it entirely. But why did Victorian society invest so much in asylums and institutionalization in the first place? There were three intertwined motivations. First, moral correction. The belief that mental illness could be managed, guided, or even corrected through structure, labor, and discipline. Asylums were meant to instill regularity, teach hygiene, and enforce routines, if only to convince society that the patients were under control. Second, containment. Fear of the unpredictable behavior of the mentally ill drove families and authorities to remove them from the streets. Violence, wandering, or eccentricity could provoke panic in a crowded industrial town. By confining patients, society sought both safety and control, sometimes under the guise of compassionate care. Third, experimental medicine. Asylums became laboratories for therapies ranging from hydrotherapy and occupational therapy to the more bizarre and frightening practices like restraint, cold water immersion, and electrotherapy. Doctors, always eager to test theories and demonstrate expertise, often balanced on a knife edge between genuine care and egregious experimentation. Within this environment, the public perception of asylums was a mix of awe, fear, and ridicule. Townspeople might peer through gates or windows to glimpse patients trudging through manicured grounds, some calm, some moaning, some animated in ways that inspired gossip for months. The asylum became both a moral lesson and a spectacle, a reminder that madness could strike anyone, a tool for social conformity, and, let's be honest, a source of dark fascination. Tales of patients doing strange things, screaming in the night, or being restrained for their own protection, circulated in newspapers and pub conversations alike. The average citizen oscillated between sympathy and voyeurism, never fully separating curiosity from judgment. The psychology of confinement cannot be overstated. For patients, the asylum imposed constant structure and observation. Hours were dictated by bells, meals were timed, chores assigned, and recreation monitored. Any deviation from the prescribed behavior could be met with punishment, from extra labor to solitary confinement. Patients quickly learned that survival was less about treatment and more about compliance. Long-term residency often eroded individuality, replaced by the rhythms of institutional life. But within that structure, some found solace in small routines, friendships, and even secret rebellions. The human mind, as ever, adapted, finding micro-liberations within walls meant to confine. Humor, though dark, was not absent even here. One can imagine patients whispering among themselves, trading winks, or quietly mocking the absurdity of daily life. The rigid schedules, the odd treatments, and the overly solemn staff. And for us, the modern observer, it's almost absurd to consider that families didn't send letters or visit politely. They sent a relative to a padded room and checked care provided off the list. Hence, as one might quip, back then, your relatives didn't send you postcards. They sent you a padded room. That phrase captures both the dread and dark humor that underpinned Victorian attitudes, an acknowledgement that, for the majority, the asylum was as much about social management as it was about medical intervention. Education and social hierarchy among staff also shaped perception. Superintendents, matrons, and attendants carried authority that extended into moral judgment. The patient's behavior was seen as reflective not just of their mental state, but of family character, social status, and moral fiber. Every scream, every hesitation, every glance became a diagnostic clue, or sometimes a moral indictment. The Victorian mind loved order, classification, and hierarchy, and the asylum embodied all three for staff and patients alike. Even the architecture of asylums reflected these values. Symmetrical buildings, high walls, and orderly courtyards were designed to inspire calm, deter, escape, and project authority. Patients were moved from dormitories to workrooms to exercise yards and back again in a rigid choreography that reinforced institutional control. Gardens, when present, were as much about demonstrating benevolence as they were about rehabilitation. The physical layout, much like the daily schedules, communicated power, morality, and control. By the end of the 19th century, asylums were well-entrenched institutions, emblematic of Victorian society's simultaneous fear of madness and confidence in the corrective powers of order. Yet, beneath the surface, the human reality was far messier. Patients experienced fear, confusion, boredom, and occasional care. Staff navigated moral, legal, and practical pressures. Society oscillated between fascination and moral judgment. The asylum was a microcosm of Victorian life itself, structured, hierarchical, moralistic, and occasionally absurd. Life inside a Victorian asylum was defined by rhythm, repetition, and regulation. From the moment the first light crept through barred windows Every aspect of a patient's existence was orchestrated by someone else. Imagine, if you will, waking up in a dormitory filled with rows of narrow beds, each occupied by a patient half asleep, half aware of the world's demands. A chorus of groans and coughs filling the room. The first sound to greet you wasn't a bird, a rooster, or the sun's gentle rays. It was the bell. Yes, the bell. The bell that didn't sing a tune of promise or opportunity, but instead served as a blunt reminder. Someone else controls your every move. Right? Your morning routine, your meals, your exercise, your very existence timed, measured, and enforced. The day typically began before the sun had fully risen, with attendants moving among the rows of patients, calling out names, prodding those who had been reluctant to rise, and making sure that no one lingered too long in a state of comfort. Comfort was a luxury, not afforded in asylums. Roll out of your bed of straw or thin mattress, sometimes shared with another patient if the dormitory was overcrowded, and shuffle to the washroom. These were rarely more than communal basins or a row of buckets, and privacy was non-existent. You would clean as best as you could, often with cold water and limited soap, the chill seeping into your bones, and your reflection in the dull, cracked mirror, only reminding you that individuality was a fleeting concept here. Breakfast followed quickly. Gruel, bread, perhaps a weak tea if fortune smiled. All consumed in a dining hall where silence was enforced or whispering was punished. Each meal was timed to the minute. Lateness was noted. Murmuring while eating was recorded as disobedience. Attendants patrolled the long tables, eyes sharp for infractions. It was a performance of control, a demonstration that the asylum had order over bodies, over time, over will. Imagine gulping down tasteless porridge while being watched, while knowing the slightest misstep might result in a reminder extra chores, a lecture, or worse, isolation. Humor, if it appeared, had to be subtle, whispered, or secret. Even the social niceties of a communal meal were stripped of warmth. After breakfast, patients were assigned to work therapy. This was presented as rehabilitation and moral improvement, but in reality, it was a mix of labor, supervision, and monotony. Tasks varied depending on age, ability, and the whims of the attending staff. You might be sent to the laundry room, scrubbing clothes and linens in icy water, muscles aching, skin raw from constant friction. Some were tasked with cleaning floors or polishing brass fixtures, ensuring the asylum itself gleamed while the patients themselves remained under the spotlight. Others worked in the gardens, tending plants under the sun, overseen by a watchful matron or attendant. Even in what might be called outdoor labor, there was no freedom, no escape from the gaze of authority. Every movement, every pause, every sigh was monitored. Humans are adaptive creatures, but adaptation under constant scrutiny carries a cost. Days bled into one another. Lights out was at a set hour, meals occurred on schedule, exercise was supervised, and recreation was limited. Patients learned to anticipate every bell, every instruction, every inspection. Monotony became both enemy and companion. It numbed the senses, yet it also offered the only predictability in a life devoid of autonomy. Those who attempted to inject spontaneity improvised conversations, quiet songs, or even minor acts of defiance risked reprimand. The psychological toll was profound. Anxiety, depression, and despair were constant companions, though rarely acknowledged beyond medical reports. Overcrowding exacerbated the strain. Dormitories often housed dozens of patients, crammed into tight quarters with minimal bedding. Privacy was an alien concept. Shared bathrooms, communal washing areas, and narrow sleeping spaces meant that personal boundaries were virtually non-existent. The sounds of snoring, coughing, and occasional cries from fellow patients never fully ceased, infiltrating even the brief moments of rest. Disease spread easily in these conditions. Lice, scabies, and other ailments were rampant. Personal hygiene, limited by the institution, was a daily battle. Patients learned to cope, to negotiate space, and to endure the constant presence of others, sometimes friendly, sometimes hostile, often indifferent. Meal times punctuated the day with ritualistic monotony. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner followed strict schedules. Nutritionally, meals were functional rather than indulgent. Gruel thick with flour, bread that was often stale or hard, and minimal protein or fresh produce, even when food was plentiful. The psychological experience of dining was shaped by surveillance, hierarchy, and fear of censure. Patients ate together, yet in isolation from autonomy, with conversations curtailed, gestures monitored, and expressions of preference or complaint discouraged. If you happen to enjoy a meal too heartily, it might be noted as excessive appetite or disorderly behavior, leading to further scrutiny. Beyond meals and work, the day involved treatments and routines designed to reinforce discipline, maintain hygiene, and simulate normalcy. Some patients underwent medical inspections, mental evaluations, or therapeutic interventions. Hydrotherapy, cold water baths, showers, or immersions was administered with strict timing. The concept of relaxation was subordinated to regimentation. Every bath, every walk, every seated period was timed and controlled. Recreational activities, if permitted, were carefully supervised. Reading was allowed selectively, and writing exercises were often introduced to occupy the mind and promote moral development. Social interaction was permitted but limited, structured, and constantly assessed. Staff played a critical role in maintaining this daily rhythm. Masters, matrons, attendants, and physicians oversaw activities, ensuring the rules were followed to the letter. Their presence was a reminder of power, authority, and surveillance. Fear was a tool as much as guidance, and kindness was often pragmatic, administered to maintain order rather than genuine compassion. Patients quickly learned the boundaries of acceptable behavior, navigating a landscape where one misstep could result in punishment, while adherents earned minimal rewards, an extra book to read, a slightly better sleeping arrangement, or merely the absence of reprimand. Control and compliance were the currencies of survival. The psychological impact of this rigid schedule cannot be understated. Humans, deprived of choice and forced into constant observation, experienced profound effects on mental and emotional well-being. Autonomy was eroded, individuality suppressed. The days were long, predictable, and unyielding. Even small acts of self-expression required stealth, secrecy, and courage. Over time, patients adapted, forming small social networks for emotional support, sharing whispered jokes, or passing small tokens of resistance. A flower plucked from a garden, a folded note, a quiet gesture. Yet the overarching reality remained. Every moment of life was governed by the asylum structure. And through it all, humor persisted, even if only in the imagination. For the patient, the absurdity of the day became a lens through which to endure. Imagine waking up every morning to a bell, not for school, but to remind you someone else controls your every move. That bell, constant and unrelenting, marked the passage of time with precision, but also served as a darkly comic reminder of the absurdity of total institutional control. Over years, some patients even adapted to the routines with a grim acceptance, finding in repetition a peculiar sense of stability, even if it was at the cost of personal freedom. Life inside a Victorian asylum was regimented not only by schedules and labor, but also by the constant administration of treatments, therapies, and what staff at the time considered medical care. From the moment a patient was admitted, they were assessed for the most suitable, or in some cases, the most fashionable forms of intervention. Imagine a day where your routine was punctuated by cold baths, electric shocks, dietary restrictions, herbal concoctions, and, if the doctor saw fit, a session in isolation, all under the ever-watchful eyes of physicians, nurses, and attendants. Right? In this world, care and cruelty were often intertwined, and the line between them was as thin as the walls of the padded rooms themselves. One of the most common treatments was the cold bath. Patients would be led to a large, often stone-lined tub filled with ice-cold water and immersed, sometimes partially, sometimes fully, depending on the severity of their condition. The water's shock was believed to jolt the mind into clarity, to expel the bad humors or quell violent tendencies. There was little consideration for comfort. Shivering, gasping, and the numbing of fingers and toes were all part of the expected experience. And yet, attendants and doctors alike were convinced that these baths were therapeutic. Patients described it as a punishment disguised as treatment, a daily reminder that their body and mind were not entirely their own. Sure, a cold bath might shock your senses. A patient might think wryly, but at least it wakes you up faster than coffee. Electric shock therapy, in its earliest experimental forms, was another intervention. Static electricity, rudimentary Leyden jars, and other early devices were used to administer controlled shocks to the patient, often in attempts to correct erratic behavior or stimulate a dull mind. There was an air of spectacle to these procedures. The crackle of electricity, the flinching of a body, and the astonishment of both staff and onlookers. For the patient, it was an intense experience, fear mixed with confusion, as the body jerked involuntarily and the mind tried to process the sensations. Right? Today we think of electric shock therapy in a clinical, regulated context. But in the Victorian era, it was as much about experimentation as about actual care. Restraints were another central component of asylum treatment. Patients were often secured in leather straps, metal cuffs, or even padded cages. This was justified as a protective measure to prevent self-harm or aggression toward others. But in practice, it was a tool of control as much as of care. A patient might be restrained for hours, sometimes days, left to sit in near immobility under strict supervision. The psychological toll was enormous, a sense of helplessness, frustration, and paradoxically, dependence on those who controlled the restraints. Nurses and attendants were tasked with monitoring the restrained patients, ensuring that no one injured themselves further and that no escape from control was attempted. Isolation, both in small rooms and padded cells, was another treatment modality. For those deemed violent, overly disruptive, or excessively melancholic, seclusion was thought to calm the mind. Imagine being placed in a silent, bare room, walls padded but furniture minimal, with nothing to distract from your own thoughts. Sometimes, isolation was therapeutic, giving patients a reprieve from the chaos of crowded dormitories. Other times, it was torturous, a psychological experiment in control. Patients often developed heightened anxiety, a deepened sense of alienation, or even paranoia after prolonged isolation. The Victorian belief in solitude as a cure for mental disturbance was well-intentioned, if deeply misguided. Herbal remedies were widely used as well. Apothecaries, or physicians, prepared potions from herbs, roots, and other natural ingredients, aiming to treat everything from insomnia and hysteria to fevers and digestive complaints. Patients were administered decoctions, tinctures, and salves, often with a strict schedule. The smell of these remedies, bitter, pungent, and sometimes nauseating, pervaded the wards. Some were mildly effective. Others were placebo, or worse, toxic if improperly measured. Leeches were sometimes applied to draw bad blood, a practice rooted in centuries-old humoral theory. Imagine sitting with cold leeches attached to your arm, a slimy and uncomfortable sensation that the doctors insisted would restore balance and health. Yeah, the Victorian mind had its own logic, and it wasn't always comfortable for those on the receiving end. Dietary interventions were another cornerstone of treatment. Patients were sometimes placed on strict diets intended to regulate the humors or improve temperament. For some, this meant more bread and water. For others, special broths or herbal infusions. Food was rarely an indulgence, and the taste was often unpleasant. Meals were timed, monitored, and sometimes restricted as a form of discipline masquerading as therapy. A patient's appetite was not entirely their own. It was an instrument of treatment, a tool to shape behavior or perceived mental state. Attendants, nurses, and physicians formed a hierarchy within the asylum, each with distinct responsibilities. Physicians were primarily responsible for diagnosis and prescribing treatment, though their knowledge was limited by the era's scientific understanding. Nurses managed day-to-day patient care, overseeing baths, administering medication, and enforcing rules. Attendants acted as the direct enforcers, monitoring behavior, guiding patients through labor or recreation, and ensuring compliance with every instruction. The interplay between these roles created a strict power dynamic. Patients learned quickly that resistance could bring swift consequences, while compliance earned, at best, small reprieves. Yet within these rigid systems, moments of human connection sometimes emerged. A patient might receive an extra blanket from a sympathetic attendant, or a small act of kindness from a nurse who understood the monotony and fear that dominated daily life. These instances were rare, fleeting, but they provided glimmers of humanity amid an otherwise regimented existence. Patients learned to read body language, anticipate moods, and exploit tiny cracks in the institutional armor to experience minor relief. Humor often persisted, if only mentally. Imagining the absurdity of taking a cold bath while thinking, "Sure, it shocks my senses, but at least I'll be alert for the next lecture about my moral failings." Despite the occasional glimmer of levity, treatments were inherently tied to control. Every intervention, physical, chemical, or psychological, was a means of asserting authority over the patient's body and mind. Patients were acutely aware that even the most benign-seeming therapies were inextricably linked to the institution's power. Resistance, subtle or overt, was fraught with risk. Complaints, evasion, or defiance could result in further isolation, more intense restraints, or repeated therapies administered with even less compassion. Experimental remedies blurred the line between care and cruelty. Physicians often acted as pioneers within their limited knowledge base, attempting novel combinations of herbs, diets, and physical interventions. Some patients were subjected to new techniques or treatments under the guise of therapeutic innovation. Successes were lauded, failures quietly recorded, and the burden of failure fell entirely on the patient. Anxiety, mistrust, and fear became as pervasive as the treatments themselves. Socially, patients were aware of each other's experiences and judgments. Hearing about another's treatment shock therapy, extended isolation, or the application of leeches created an environment of both fear and shared understanding. Rumors spread quickly through dormitories and work areas, shaping behavior and reinforcing the idea that compliance was necessary for survival. Over time, patients internalized the institution's expectations, moderating behavior and tempering impulses to avoid additional interventions. Sure, a cold bath might shock your senses, but at least it wakes you up faster than coffee. Walking through the halls of a Victorian asylum, it's easy to forget that behind every door was a human being, with a life, a story, a mind that had not yet been entirely broken by circumstance. While the institution itself was defined by schedules, rules, and treatments, the experience of each patient was intensely personal and often harrowing. Diaries, letters, and records from the 19th century reveal a tapestry of experiences, from quiet resilience to outright despair. Yeah, it wasn't just the treatments that shaped their days. It was the constant pressure, the monotony, and the sheer lack of autonomy that defined what it meant to live there. Let's start with the differences in experience. Age was a major factor. Younger patients, teenagers, or even children experienced fear and confusion, struggling to understand why they had been removed from their homes or why their parents had agreed to their institutionalization. Imagine a 1-2-year-old waking up in a dormitory filled with adults. The smell of disinfectant, wet wool, and unwashed bodies thick in the air. The morning bell rings, dragging them out of whatever fitful sleep they managed to snatch, only to begin a day of repetitive tasks, laundry, cleaning, or walking laps around the grounds. Older patients, while perhaps more aware of the institutional mechanics, had the added weight of shame and societal judgment. Many had been committed because their mental health was poorly understood, or their families wanted them out of sight. In this context, the asylum became both a physical and social cage. Gender and class also dictated experiences. Women were often subjected to stricter moral scrutiny. Their behavior was policed not only for perceived mental instability, but for conformity to Victorian ideals of femininity. They might be placed in solitary wards for behaviors as minor as speaking out of turn, laughing too loudly, or failing to adhere to dress codes. Men, meanwhile, might be assigned more physically demanding labor under the guise of therapy, such as scrubbing floors or tending gardens for hours on end. Class distinctions came into play as well. Wealthier patients sometimes had better rooms, cleaner bedding, and more varied diets, whereas paupers endured overcrowded dormitories, limited food, and minimal privacy. Yet, despite these distinctions, all shared the psychological weight of being controlled and observed at nearly every moment. Coping mechanisms were as varied as the patients themselves. Humans are remarkably resilient, even in environments designed to strip them of control. Many patients found solace in small games, whether covertly rolling a ball through the corridors, trading whispered stories, or passing notes hidden in laundry baskets. Singing was another refuge. Quietly humming a hymn, a popular song, or even composing original tunes helped preserve a sense of self and continuity. Imagination became a powerful tool, too. Patients would envision themselves outside the walls, wandering through fields, visiting family, or experiencing the freedom of daily life beyond the regimented routine. Yeah. Imagination was a secret escape, a personal rebellion against the monotony imposed by the institution. Personal accounts from the time highlight the spectrum of emotional responses. Some patients adapted with a muted acceptance. Their personalities reshaped to fit the asylum's rhythms. Others exhibited deep psychological trauma. Fear, anxiety, and loss of identity became constant companions. One diary entry from a woman in a London asylum recalls her waking every morning to the shrill clang of a bell, a sound that heralded the start of a day filled with endless repetition and supervision. She writes about the terror of the first cold bath, the discomfort of rough wool uniforms, and the pervasive sense that every action was scrutinized, judged, and cataloged by the staff. Another patient, a young man committed due to a nervous breakdown, describes the dormitories as both a refuge and a prison. He notes the camaraderie formed with fellow patients' shared stories, subtle humor, and the small kindnesses that punctuated an otherwise oppressive day, but also the constant fear of punishment. Being caught conversing at the wrong time, skipping a chore, or showing any sign of dissent could lead to confinement, loss of privileges, or even harsher treatments. The asylum, in this sense, was an ecosystem where social dynamics among patients were as important as their interactions with staff. Fear and anxiety were omnipresent. Patients never knew if today would bring a cold bath, isolation, or an electric shock. The unpredictability compounded their sense of helplessness. Even those who had spent months or years in the institution could not completely adjust. The system was designed to maintain control, not comfort. The mental strain was enormous, and many patients experienced what we would now recognize as severe trauma. Right? Living under constant observation, where every thought or action could trigger a punitive response, was a form of psychological stress that could last a lifetime. Yet, amidst the monotony and fear, small victories occurred. Patients learned to negotiate micro-freedoms. The timing of bathroom breaks, the route through the corridors, or the subtle avoidance of overzealous attendants. Secret signals, nods, and gestures among fellow patients created a hidden language of survival. It was a daily exercise in observation, patience, and cunning. A wink or a whispered word could be the difference between a moment of comfort and a reminder of institutional authority. Cultural and societal factors played a role as well. Victorian society viewed mental illness through a lens of morality, sin, and social deviance. Patients internalized these judgments, often blaming themselves for their condition or fearing social ostracization. Diaries reveal moments of self-reproach, mixed with longing for familial connection and freedom. Some patients tried to write letters to relatives, only to have them censored or withheld by staff, creating a further sense of isolation. Humorous observation was also a subtle coping mechanism. Even in the most oppressive circumstances, patients found ways to laugh at absurdities. You might not remember your last meal, a patient might joke to themselves, but you'll never forget the timing of the morning bell. These moments of humor, quiet and private, helped preserve a sense of self-worth and identity, even when the institution sought to erode it. Records also highlight the diversity of patient experiences. Some were committed for melancholia, others for mania, hysteria, or nervous disorders. Each diagnosis carried different treatments, social perceptions, and consequences. Older patients often described a longing for normalcy, simple walks outside, reading a book, or having conversations without fear of punishment. Younger patients frequently struggled with confusion and fear, lacking the understanding of why they had been removed from their families. These experiences underscore the deeply personal nature of asylum life. Even within a rigid, standardized system, interaction among patients was another complex layer. Friendships were fragile but important. Alliances could provide protection or access to small privileges. Rivalries, often over scarce resources or perceived favoritism by staff, created tension. Patients learned quickly to navigate these social waters, balancing caution with trust, forming communities that were essential for survival, yet always under the shadow of authority. You might not remember your last meal, but you'll never forget the timing of the morning bell. Walking through a Victorian asylum, it's impossible to separate the experience of the patients from the structure and personalities of the staff who ran it. Behind every locked door, every iron gate, and every padded room, there existed a complex hierarchy of authority. The staff were the invisible and sometimes very visible force shaping daily life. Yeah, right? The daily routines, the punishments, even the minor comforts of the asylum were mediated by these figures of control, and their presence could make or break a patient's sanity. At the top of the hierarchy stood the superintendents. These men, sometimes women in smaller institutions, were responsible for the overall management of the asylum. They determined policies, oversaw staffing, and reported to local boards or charitable organizations. Their word was law, or at least it had the weight of law in the halls of the asylum. Superintendents often came from professional backgrounds, sometimes with medical training, sometimes from bureaucratic or military systems. Their status afforded them privileges, private offices, comfortable living quarters on site, and influence over funding, staffing, and the treatment protocols applied to the patients. Yeah, you might say the superintendent was the captain of this floating ship of madness, and every decision, from soap rationing to bath schedules, passed through their hands. Below them were the physicians, the doctors of the asylum. These men, sometimes women though rarely, were responsible for diagnosing patients, prescribing treatments, and overseeing the application of therapies. Right? And their influence could be terrifying or life-saving, depending on temperament and knowledge. Some physicians were forward-thinking, experimenting with early psychological theory or advocating humane treatment. Others were rigid, cold, and authoritarian, believing in strict adherence to rules, cold baths, dietary restrictions, or shock therapy as necessary tools of moral correction. Patients quickly learned to read the faces and moods of physicians, understanding that a frown could signal a day of punishment or additional labor. Then came the matrons, the women charged with the day-to-day management of female wards, children, or sometimes entire wings. Okay. These were the women of the asylum who balanced authority and exhaustion in equal measure. Many matrons were overworked, underpaid, and expected to maintain strict discipline while also managing cleaning, meals, and patient supervision. Their word could provoke fear and obedience as they administered punishments, guided activities, or enforced bedtimes. But matrons were human too, and favoritism, fatigue, or even small acts of kindness could shape the lives of patients. A matron who smiled, allowed an extra minute at breakfast, or whispered advice could make a world of difference. But her wrath, conversely, could create days of misery. Below matrons were the attendants, often younger, less trained staff tasked with the closest, most personal interactions with patients. These attendants were responsible for leading patients to work or recreation, supervising meals, enforcing hygiene, and assisting in treatments or confinement. Yeah, right? It was an exhausting and often thankless job, performed under the watchful eyes of superiors. Many attendants were poorly compensated and trained, and the stress of managing, challenging, sometimes violent, or distressed patients often led to short tempers and harsh methods. Unfortunately, patients bore the brunt of human fatigue, frustration, and institutional pressure. Power dynamics in the asylum were omnipresent. Patients existed at the bottom, with almost no autonomy, while staff exercised varying degrees of control. Within the staff itself, hierarchies created competition and tension. Physicians sometimes clashed with matrons over treatment protocols. Attendants vied for recognition or favor. Yeah, right? This internal competition could amplify the oppression of patients, as staff exerted authority to assert their own position in the pecking order. A patient caught between a strict physician and a hot-tempered matron was in a precarious position, subject to conflicting orders and unpredictable discipline. Corruption and favoritism were not uncommon. Okay, yeah, right? Some staff took advantage of their position to receive bribes or favors, providing better meals or slightly more comfortable bedding in exchange for gifts, small sums of money, or flattery from patients' families. In rarer cases, attendants exploited their authority for personal amusement, enforcing arbitrary rules or punishing patients out of spite. For patients, the asylum was a world of uncertainty. Would today be tolerable or terrifying? It often depended on the whims, mood, or personal biases of the staff. Social status within the asylum staff mirrored broader Victorian hierarchies. Physicians and superintendents held prestige and autonomy. Matrons held authority but were constrained by overwork and social expectations. And attendants were low-status employees expected to follow orders without question. Each layer exerted control on those beneath them, which meant that the staff themselves were under pressure to maintain their position. Mistakes could be career-ending. Favoritism or leniency could be seen as weakness. Patients, meanwhile, had to navigate all of these layers, understanding that small gestures, compliance, or subtle negotiation could improve their day or protect them from punishment. Humor, often a private survival mechanism for both staff and patients, occasionally punctuated the grim reality. Being a patient was a full-time job, a diary might read, but so was being an overworked matron with zero patience. Yeah, right? Both roles demanded constant attention, vigilance, and endurance, though the stakes were drastically different. Patients endured the physical and psychological weight of confinement. Staff endured the logistical, social, and sometimes moral weight of managing human beings in a rigid, unforgiving system. Observing the relationship between staff and patients, one sees the constant negotiation of power, even acts that might appear minor, smiling at a patient, allowing a whispered conversation, letting someone linger a few extra moments at the wash basin, could shift the atmosphere of a ward. Likewise, abrupt reprimands, public shaming, or excessive enforcement of rules reinforced fear and obedience. Staff wielded this power deliberately or instinctively, shaping not only the patient's experiences, but also the overall culture of the institution. Interestingly, the presence of authority could create a subtle psychological dynamic among patients as well. Some formed alliances or adapted behaviors to curry favor with particular attendants or matrons, while others deliberately avoided attention to reduce risk. The observant patient could detect patterns in staff behavior, learning who to trust, who to avoid, and which actions might result in punishment. Survival, in many cases, was less about mental health recovery and more about reading human behavior under extreme circumstances. Training and supervision of staff were also crucial factors. Many attendants were young and inexperienced, learning on the job, which could lead to inconsistent treatment of patients. Matrimonial guidance was sometimes provided to new staff, but the reality of long hours, difficult patients, and institutional constraints often resulted in improvisation, which could either mitigate or exacerbate the hardships of the asylum. Yeah, right? The human element, for better or worse, played a central role in how rules were applied and how daily life unfolded. Finally, the hierarchy and structure of staff influenced public perception of asylums. Physicians and superintendents were often seen as authorities in science and medicine, lending legitimacy to the institution. Their presence reassured families, suggesting that their relatives were in competent hands, even if the methods seemed harsh or questionable. Matrons and attendants, meanwhile, were invisible to outsiders, but essential to maintaining order, discipline, and daily operations. The complex interplay of visibility, authority, and function shaped how the public understood the asylum and its purpose, as well as how patients experienced it internally. Being a patient was a full-time job, but so was being an overworked matron with zero patience. Life in a Victorian asylum was controlled, regulated, and often oppressive, and it's no wonder that some patients sought to push back, even in subtle ways. Yeah, right? Resistance took many forms, from small, almost invisible acts to full-blown attempts to escape, and occasionally, violent uprisings erupted when frustration and despair reached a tipping point. Understanding these moments of defiance helps us see the humanity of patients, how, despite being treated as objects of observation or containment, they still asserted their agency, no matter how limited it was. The simplest form of resistance was often subtle and almost invisible. Yeah? A patient might delay completing a work assignment, hide a tool, or pretend to misunderstand instructions. Laundry work, gardening, or cleaning could be sabotaged in small ways. A scrubbed shirt might not be fully cleaned, a broom left in an awkward spot, or herbs miscounted in the medicinal preparation room. These small acts were not merely mischief. They were expressions of autonomy, a way for individuals to reclaim control over their environment. The challenge, of course, was avoiding detection. Staff were observant, rules were strict, and any perceived defiance could trigger punishment. Secret communication was another tactic. Patients sometimes wrote notes to one another, smuggling messages within books, under bedding, or even in scraps of clothing. These notes could convey warnings, encouragement, or information about planned resistance. Right? Think of it as a clandestine postal system, operating right under the noses of matrons and attendants. In some cases, these messages helped coordinate minor acts of rebellion, like collective refusals to participate in a labor task or secret gatherings in dormitories after lights out. Some patients took more direct action, attempting to escape the confines of the asylum entirely. Doors were locked, gates were guarded, and walls were often high and reinforced. But a few daring individuals tried to slip out. Escape required ingenuity, timing a walk past a distracted attendant, hiding under laundry carts, or exploiting shifts in staff supervision. Right? But the risks were enormous. Caught escapees faced solitary confinement, increased restraints, or corporal punishment. And even if successful, they had to navigate a society that often viewed them as dangerous or mentally unstable. Running through muddy fields or city streets, only to be chased by a vigilant matron with a truncheon, was not the romanticized notion of freedom. In extreme cases, escapes escalated into riots. Large asylums sometimes housed hundreds of patients in confined spaces, with rules that were not only strict but often arbitrary. Tensions could simmer for weeks or months, fueled by exhaustion, mistreatment, or despair. Occasionally, this pressure erupted into collective defiance patients, refusing work assignments, shouting at staff, overturning furniture, or attempting to break windows and doors. Right? Riots were terrifying for staff, and often led to reinforcement of discipline measures afterward. One infamous example occurred at the Bethlehem Royal Hospital in London, where a group of patients refused to comply with a new schedule of cold water baths. They barricaded themselves in their ward, and though the rebellion was eventually quelled, it left staff shaken and demonstrated that even in the most controlled environments, resistance was possible. The consequences for rebellion were severe. Solitary confinement was commonly used, often in small, windowless cells, sometimes referred to as punishment rooms or isolation chambers. Patients might be left in darkness for hours or even days, deprived of social interaction, with only minimal food or water. Physical restraints, like leather cuffs or chains, were applied to prevent further disruption. And for those caught in the act of overt sabotage or attempted escape, punishments could escalate. Beatings, extended labor duties, or verbal humiliation in front of other patients were not uncommon. These punitive measures served as deterrents to the rest of the population, reinforcing the absolute authority of staff while attempting to prevent additional acts of defiance. Notable historical cases of resistance provide insight into both the desperation and ingenuity of patients. One remarkable story comes from the late 1802, when a group of patients at a provincial asylum coordinated an escape by exploiting a flaw in the nightly rounds. They waited until the guards changed shifts, then silently removed a window latch, climbing out one by one into the darkness. Many were recaptured, but a few managed to reach neighboring towns, leaving behind a trail of confusion and embarrassment for the asylum staff. The incident prompted stricter security measures and illustrates that even under the strictest control, the human desire for freedom could not be entirely suppressed. Subtle collective acts were also common. Patients might feign illness to avoid labor duties, deliberately slow their pace during supervised exercise, or create distractions that allowed others to engage in minor acts of rebellion. Right? Even laughter or whispered jokes could be considered subversive, as the rigid asylum culture demanded obedience and conformity at all times. The ingenuity required to perform these small acts safely reflects the constant negotiation between authority and autonomy in such institutions. Humor and imagination played a role in patient resistance as well. Patients often use storytelling, music, or art as a means to subvert the oppressive atmosphere. A whispered game, a shared poem, or even drawing caricatures of staff members could provide a psychological release, allowing patients to assert a form of intellectual or emotional freedom. While these acts might seem minor compared to escaping the asylum, they were vital for maintaining mental resilience in an environment that sought to suppress individuality. Escape attempts and acts of resistance also had social implications among patients. Yeah? Those who participated in acts of defiance were often elevated in the eyes of their peers, seen as daring or heroic, while those who complied fully with staff orders might be viewed as cowards or collaborators. This dynamic created informal social hierarchies, which could shift rapidly depending on the success or failure of resistance attempts. Even in confinement, patients found ways to assert agency, build reputations, and establish networks of support. The staff's response to resistance often reflected broader societal attitudes toward mental illness. Punishment and discipline were framed as moral correction, while failure to comply was seen as evidence of disorder or moral deficiency. Yeah, right? This approach reinforced the stigma surrounding mental health, creating a cycle in which the very acts of seeking autonomy or self-expression were interpreted as proof of instability. Patients were simultaneously oppressed and pathologized, punished for behaviors that were, in other contexts, perfectly understandable responses to confinement. Trying to escape? Good luck. The door locks were sturdier than your last mortgage agreement. Okay? And while the joke lands today, for the patients it was no laughing matter. Every attempt at escape was a high-stakes gamble, testing courage, ingenuity, and endurance, with potential consequences that could last days, weeks, or even longer. Even today, these accounts of rebellion remind us that the desire for autonomy, dignity, and freedom is a universal human trait. Yeah, right? Patients were not simply passive recipients of treatment. They were active participants in their own lives, finding creative ways to assert, control, challenge authority, and survive psychologically under extreme conditions. From subtle acts of sabotage to daring escape attempts, these moments of defiance reveal the resilience and resourcefulness of individuals living within oppressive systems. Victorian asylums were not merely institutions tucked away behind high walls. They were central to public imagination. Yeah, right? For the townsfolk and city dwellers alike, asylums represented both a necessary social measure and a source of mystery, fear, and fascination. The public's perception was a tangled web of curiosity, dread, and moral judgment. After all, mental illness was not widely understood, and many believed that anyone confined in a lunatic asylum had crossed some invisible line of social or moral acceptability. For ordinary citizens, the asylum was simultaneously a symbol of social control and a spectacle. People were both horrified and intrigued by the stories that filtered out of these institutions, often through newspaper reports or rumor. Okay? Tales of escape attempts, patient uprisings, and alleged mistreatment captured public attention. The average Victorian might pass the walls of an asylum and shiver, imagining the eerie cries, strange rituals, and mysterious medical procedures within. Gossip about these places spread like wildfire, reinforcing the notion that the mentally ill were both dangerous and pitiable. This fascination extended naturally into literature. Victorian novels often exploited the public's curiosity and fear, blending Gothic horror with social commentary. Yeah? Writers like Charlotte Bronte, Charles Dickens, and Wilkie Collins depicted asylums and the mentally ill in ways that ranged from sensationalized to empathetic. In Dickens's work, for instance, the depiction of institutional care highlighted both systemic cruelty and the dehumanization of patients, emphasizing the moral failings of a society that confined its most vulnerable members. Meanwhile, Gothic writers leaned into the terror, portraying asylums as dark labyrinths filled with despair, echoing public anxieties about control, confinement, and the unknown workings of the mind. Newspapers contributed significantly to the shaping of asylum reputation. Yeah? Sensationalist journalism often reported on scandalous events, focusing on alleged abuses, escapes, or riots. The press rarely provided nuanced accounts. Instead, stories were crafted to shock, entertain, and sell papers. Headlines like Horrors Behind the Walls of St. Mary's Asylum, or Insane Patients Revolt in Terrifying Rebellion, captivated readers, creating a culture where asylums were seen as simultaneously frightening and necessary. For the public, these stories confirmed both moralistic fears and the belief that strict institutionalization was essential to protect society. The depiction of asylums in literature and the press served another purpose: social critique. Yeah, right? By highlighting the inhumane conditions, excessive punishment, and questionable medical practices, authors could challenge the assumptions of Victorian society. Novels and exposés painted a picture of a system that was supposed to cure or rehabilitate, but often perpetuated suffering. Readers were invited to question whether confinement and moral correction were truly effective, or simply tools of control for the privileged, reinforcing class hierarchies and the power of institutional authority. Interestingly, public fascination wasn't only negative. There was also curiosity about treatment methods and the supposed science behind asylums. Okay? People were eager to learn how doctors diagnosed and managed insanity, how attendants maintained order, and how different therapies, from cold baths to work therapy, were applied. Some Victorian visitors were genuinely intrigued, observing asylums almost like a spectacle of science and human behavior. While others approached with fear or moral judgment, the asylum became both a laboratory and a theater, where society could witness in part the extremes of medical experimentation and social control. The portrayal of asylums in literature also helped to shape the emerging field of psychiatry. Yeah? By documenting cases, behaviors, and treatments, writers, both fictional and non-fictional, created a cultural archive that informed early psychiatric thought. Doctors and reformers could reference popular accounts to justify changes in practice, argue for better conditions, or propose alternative approaches to treatment. The widespread attention brought to these institutions helped elevate mental health to a matter of public discourse. Even if the understanding was still rudimentary, humor also found its place amidst the dark fascination. Right? Satirical works, cartoons, and anecdotal writings often poked fun at the rigidity of asylum life, the eccentricities of staff, or the oddities of patient routines. Observers commented on the absurdities inherent in an institution where schedules, rules, and punishments were enforced with almost obsessive precision. Back then, asylums sold more stories than postcards, and none of them were bedtime reading, people would joke, highlighting the surreal combination of fear, fascination, and dark amusement that surrounded Victorian asylums. Asylums also reflected broader societal anxieties. Yeah. Okay. The fear of mental illness often intersected with concerns about morality, class, and gender. Women were disproportionately admitted for behaviors considered hysterical or inappropriate, while men might be institutionalized for extreme poverty or social nonconformity. These perceptions were amplified through media and literature, perpetuating stereotypes and influencing how the public interpreted madness. The asylum, then, became a mirror, reflecting not only medical ignorance, but also the social norms, prejudices, and power structures of Victorian society. Public perception had long-lasting consequences. Yeah? The fear, fascination, and misunderstanding of asylums influenced policy and reform, pushing for changes that improved care for some while continuing to marginalize others. Campaigns for better conditions, more humane treatments, and oversight were partly fueled by literature and reporting that exposed abuses, scandals, or extreme practices. The narrative surrounding asylums became a catalyst for reform, demonstrating the power of public perception in shaping medical and social practices. Victorian asylums also occupied a unique space in the cultural imagination. Right? They were often depicted as settings for mystery, drama, and moral lessons in novels, theater, and later film. Their architectural design, large, imposing structures with high walls and long corridors, reinforced their mystique. The combination of physical confinement and social stigma created a potent symbol of control, fear, and the limits of human understanding. Authors and playwrights capitalized on this, creating stories that balanced realism with Gothic horror, reflecting both societal concerns and the public's appetite for sensationalism. The fascination with asylums extended beyond literature. Yeah? Public lectures, exhibitions, and guided tours of asylum grounds, albeit controlled and sanitized, offered curious citizens a glimpse of life inside these institutions. Observers could witness treatments, schedules, and patient activities, often leaving with a mix of awe, fear, and moral judgment. This phenomenon helped reinforce the idea that asylums were essential yet enigmatic places, where society's moral and medical boundaries intersected. Ultimately, the legacy of public perception is twofold, right? On one hand, sensationalism and misunderstanding reinforced fear, stigma, and the marginalization of mental illness. On the other, the attention prompted social critique, awareness, and eventually, reform. Literature and media served as both mirrors and engines, reflecting societal anxieties while driving conversation about ethics, care, and human rights. Okay? They highlighted the tension between fascination and compassion, spectacle and science. The lessons from Victorian asylums and their portrayal in public discourse remain relevant. They remind us that public perception can influence treatment, policy, and cultural attitudes toward marginalized populations. Sensationalized stories, even when entertaining or humorous, carry consequences. They shape how society understands illness, morality, and authority. At the same time, creative expression, humor, and narrative can serve as tools for critique, empathy, and reform. Back then, asylums sold more stories than postcards, and none of them were bedtime reading. Okay? While the joke lands today, for Victorian society, it reflected a complex interplay of fear, fascination, and cultural storytelling. Patients, staff, and the public were all caught in a narrative web, where imagination and reality intersected, creating an enduring cultural legacy. The Victorian asylum, for all its darkness, fear, and at times cruelty, left a mark that reaches into modern mental health care. Yeah, right? While today's psychiatric hospitals are far removed from the towering stone institutions of the 19th century, the foundation laid by these asylums, both positive and negative, has shaped how society understands mental health, patient care, and hospital design. Initially, the purpose of asylums was containment and moral correction, but over time, administrators and reformers recognized the importance of structure, environment, and professional oversight. Okay? Victorian architects and planners designed large facilities with segregated wards, high ceilings, and expansive grounds, believing that orderly surroundings and fresh air could improve the mental state of patients. These design philosophies influenced the layout of hospitals for decades to come, embedding the idea that environment matters in healing. Wide corridors, separate wings, and organized communal spaces, all familiar elements in today's psychiatric hospitals, have their roots in Victorian experimentation with space, light, and ventilation. The rise of asylum reformers in the late 19th century also reshaped legal and medical standards. Early advocates, like John Connolly in England, pushed against restraints and harsh punishments, emphasizing observation, moral treatment, and humane care. His work inspired a shift in how patients were treated, moving from strict containment toward a more compassionate, if still rudimentary, understanding of mental illness. These principles informed later legislation on patient rights, hospital accreditation, and professional training for psychiatrists and nurses. Victorian asylums were not perfect, but they sparked conversations about responsibility, accountability, and ethical care that reverberated well into the 20th century. The legacy extends beyond architecture and law. Society's perception of mental illness slowly evolved because of the presence of these institutions. Right? Though stigma remained, and in many ways continues, the visibility of patients in structured care helped normalize discussions about mental health. People began to see that mental illness was not simply moral failure or divine punishment, but a condition requiring attention, oversight, and medical intervention. The asylum became a catalyst for dialogue, research, and eventually advocacy for patient rights. Victorian asylums also influenced the professionalization of psychiatric care. Okay? The need for trained staff physicians, nurses, attendants led to the establishment of standards, educational programs, and the emergence of psychiatry as a medical discipline. The meticulous record-keeping, case studies, and reporting that began in these institutions created an archive of clinical knowledge that is still referenced today. While many early treatments were misguided, The practice of careful observation and documentation laid the groundwork for evidence-based medicine in mental health. The human stories within these walls continue to teach resilience and empathy. Right? Patients, despite suffering confinement, strict routines, and harsh treatments, often found ways to cope, bond, and assert small measures of autonomy. From secret games and whispered notes to acts of resistance and ingenuity, these lives illuminate the strength of human spirit under extreme conditions. Their experiences serve as a reminder of why ethical reforms and humane treatment are essential in any healthcare system. Even popular culture owes a debt to the Victorian Asylum. Yeah? Literature, theater, and later film borrowed heavily from asylum imagery and narratives, embedding them in the collective imagination. From Gothic horror to psychological drama, asylums became symbols of fear, authority, and moral reflection. Today, the trope of the haunted hospital or the mysterious psychiatric ward traces its lineage back to these early Victorian institutions. While sensationalized in fiction, the reality inspired not only fear but also curiosity and inquiry into the treatment of mental illness. Modern hospitals and mental health programs, when done correctly, emphasize lessons learned from this era. The importance of humane conditions, patient observation, structured routines, and the dignity of the individual. Yeah? Ethical committees, patient advocates, and rights legislation all echo the debates of the Victorian period. Without the harsh experiments and social discourse of that time, we might not have developed the robust frameworks that guide care today. Next time you visit a hospital, think a Victorian asylum, and maybe hope they're not hiding any leeches in the supply closet. Right? While today's hospitals are free from padded rooms and daily cold baths, the quirky legacy of Victorian medical creativity and miscreativity remains a reminder of how far we've come. The societal impact of Victorian asylums is also visible in broader social policy. Yeah? The rise of institutions highlighted gaps in welfare, poverty relief, and public health systems. The recognition that certain populations needed structured support, albeit often misguided, spurred early government involvement in health and social care. Concepts such as patient observation, reporting standards, and the moral imperative of care influenced social policy, education for healthcare workers, and the eventual creation of mental health acts and patient protections across Europe and North America. Ultimately, the Victorian asylum era serves as a cautionary tale and a source of insight. Okay, right? While we cringe at the punishments, the overcrowding, and the experimental therapies, we must acknowledge the era's contribution to understanding, codifying, and institutionalizing mental health care. The lessons of ethics, compassion, and vigilance echo today in hospital wards, psychiatric clinics, and community mental health initiatives. We see both the dangers of ignorance and the potential of structured care. Even humor has a place in reflection. Satire and anecdotes remind us that historical suffering doesn't need to erase perspective or curiosity. Recognizing the absurdities of cold baths, padded rooms, or leech therapy allows us to appreciate the progress in human care. It also underscores that compassion, observation, and creativity have always been central to medicine, even when mixed with superstition or misadventure. Looking back at the world of Victorian asylums, it's impossible not to feel a mix of awe, horror, and, some incredulity. Right? The lives of patients trapped within the towering stone walls were anything but ordinary. Every day was a battle against monotony, confinement, and a society that largely misunderstood their suffering. From the moment they were admitted, patients faced rigid schedules, strict hierarchies, and relentless observation. Some were children, some elderly, some simply unlucky in a world that often equated mental illness with moral failing. And yet, despite the fear, the cold baths, the isolations, the enforced labor, countless patients found ways to endure. Their resilience is remarkable. Yeah? In cramped dormitories, with shared bathrooms and limited privacy, they carved out small acts of defiance, secret conversations, whispered letters, small games, or silent songs. These were the quiet revolts of human spirit against a system that sought to reduce them to mere subjects of control. Even under harsh rules, where any misstep could result in solitary confinement or increased restraints, patients learned strategies to survive, to maintain a sense of self, to preserve the faint embers of autonomy. Survival wasn't just physical. It was psychological, emotional, and even moral in its own way. The staff, too, played a pivotal role in this strange ecosystem. Superintendents, matrons, physicians, and attendants held immense power, and the dynamics between them and patients shaped daily life. Right? Some wielded their authority with cruelty, taking advantage of the rigid system to assert dominance. Others, rare though they were, exercised compassion, offering small kindnesses, moments of understanding, or mentorship to those under their care. The interactions between staff and patients reveal a broader lesson about human behavior. Power and vulnerability exist in delicate balance, and empathy can emerge even in the most constrained circumstances. Ethics in Victorian asylums were, well, complicated, to put it mildly. Okay. The line between care and cruelty was thin and often crossed. Treatments that today would be considered barbaric cold baths, electrical shocks, extreme isolation were seen as legitimate tools to restore moral and mental order. But within these institutions, there were also sparks of proto-scientific inquiry. Physicians documented symptoms, observed behaviors, and experimented with remedies, some grounded in genuine medical theory, some tinged with superstition. These contradictions reveal a society grappling with the unknown, trying to reconcile moral, religious, and scientific frameworks in a world where understanding of the human mind was rudimentary at best. And let's not forget the psychological toll. Yeah? For patients, every day was structured to enforce compliance, to instill routine, and supposedly to promote rehabilitation. But the constant observation, the strict schedules, and the regimented labor stripped away individuality. Fear was a constant companion, and shame permeated even the simplest activities. For many, the asylum became a place where identity was contested, memory was tested, and sanity was measured against arbitrary societal norms. The emotional scars lingered long after discharge, and the social stigma often extended beyond the walls, shaping patients' reintegration into society, or making it nearly impossible. Yet, despite these horrors, Victorian asylums laid foundations for progress. Right? They forced society to confront the existence of mental illness, to systematize care, and to consider the moral and legal responsibilities owed to vulnerable populations. While the methods were flawed and often abusive, the institutions prompted debates about ethics, patient rights, and medical practice. They created an early framework for observation, documentation, and professionalization in mental health care. In a strange way, the very structures that confined patients also sparked innovations in treatment and advocacy that echo into modern psychiatry. The legacy of these asylums is multifaceted. On one hand, they remind us of the dangers of ignorance and fear. On the other, they show the human capacity for resilience, both among patients and the reform-minded staff who push for better care. Yeah? They shaped architectural design, influenced hospital protocols, and contributed to the rise of ethical medical practice. Literature, newspapers, and social commentary drew from asylum stories, embedding them in the public imagination and highlighting societal anxieties about mental illness. Gothic novels and sensational reports may have distorted reality, but they also initiated conversations about care, control, and social responsibility. Looking at modern mental health care, we see the imprint of these institutions everywhere. Right? Patient rights, ethical oversight, structured treatment plans, therapeutic activities, and the recognition of dignity and autonomy all stem from lessons painfully learned in the Victorian era. The asylums demonstrate what happens when fear dominates policy, but also how society can evolve when empathy, observation, and reflection guide reform. Today's clinicians, social workers, and policymakers operate in a world profoundly shaped by these historical experiments in care. And let's pause for a moment for a little perspective, okay? Humor, even subtle, helps us digest history's weight. Yeah? Remember, next time your hospital breakfast feels bland, be glad it's not a weekly gruel ration monitored by a matron with a ruler. While we chuckle, the reminder is real. Human beings deserve dignity, agency, and kindness. something largely absent in Victorian asylums but now central to modern practice. Ultimately, the story of Victorian asylums is a story of humanity grappling with the unknown. Patients were individuals thrust into a system that misunderstood them. Staff were professionals or enforcers, navigating authority and morality. Society was caught between fear, fascination, and emerging science. And through it all, lessons emerged about ethics, compassion, observation, resilience, and the enduring need to balance care with respect for autonomy. Right? It's a story of struggle, survival, and incremental progress. So, as we reflect on these dark yet formative chapters, it's vital to appreciate the growth of mental health care. Yeah? We are inheritors of both the mistakes and the insights of the past. Every ethical guideline, every patient rights law, every modern hospital protocol is, in some way, a response to what was learned or painfully discovered in the crowded wards and rigid routines of Victorian asylums. The ghosts of the past whisper lessons on observation, patience, and humanity. And here's the call to action, okay? Remember the past, value compassion, and recognize the resilience of those who lived under conditions we can scarcely imagine. Right? Reflect on how far society has come in terms of patient care, mental health awareness, and ethical standards. Appreciate the human capacity for empathy, even when surrounded by fear or ignorance. And if you've been following along, subscribe to the Sleepy Time Traveler so you can keep exploring the strange, the quirky, and the eye-opening corners of history that remind us why compassion matters and why learning from the past is never optional. Because, at the end of the day, the story of Victorian asylums isn't just about padded rooms, cold baths, or leech-filled bottles. It's about people, their suffering, their resilience, their small acts of defiance, and the lessons they left behind for future generations. Yeah? Let's honor that by carrying their stories forward, understanding the roots of modern mental health care, and recognizing the value of empathy and ethical responsibility in every human interaction. And yes, maybe give yourself a quiet moment of gratitude that your morning alarm is just a bell or a phone, and not the shrill cry of someone else controlling your entire day.